Welcome to today's episode of the Medical Fitness Podcast, powered by the Medical Fitness Association and the Medicine Rehab or MRF Institute. I'm beyond excited to have the legendary Bill Kraemer on our show. Dr. Kraemer, thanks so much for taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedule to be here.
Well, thank you. It's an honor. It's always great to see and work with people who I've known in the past. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and hope we have a good podcast.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to getting started. So, on that note, I would love for you, and by the way, since this is a medical fitness podcast, as you can imagine, we're going to have many clinicians. So we'll have people across the spectrum. We'll have strength and conditioning coaches listening to this, fitness professionals, and clinicians across the spectrum of care. And so I want everyone who's listening to know, who you are and the magnitude. So I would love for you to start off by sharing your background as much as you want to share, what led to your career as a sports scientist. And even though we could talk about this for hours on end, I'd love for you to provide insight into the influence you've had on the field of strength and conditioning.
Well, first of all, I think everybody has origin stories. And for me, it really became apparent early on in my career. I grew up with the really desire to be a great football player. And for instance, I was really in Wisconsin. You were a Green Bay Packer fan, and I was a big fan of Jim Taylor, one of the Green Bay Packers. And I found out he lifted weights, and I remember thinking, wow, I got to lift weights. And I had an uncle that also was a weight trainer that lived far away. But when I visited, he showed me a set of York barbells. And then I actually asked my father, probably very similar to really thousands of young men in the 60s, was, hey, can I get a barbell set? And off the Sears Roebuck we did to buy a barbell set, et cetera, et cetera. And then I found out, decades later, obviously that Jim Taylor was part of a unique type of experiment with Alvin Roy training the entire LSU football team with weights. And that was very uncommon. But to make a long story short, so I lifted, I was a weight trainer and, for football and sports. And it was in the same era that I went to school in Wisconsin in our conference with another a guy that was also big time in weight training. That was Mike Webster of CTE fame. Mike was up at Rhinelander High School, and basically I was at Marshfield along my roommate in college and in high school teammate, Rick Griffin, who was just as good an athlete as Mike Webster, but had a number of circumstances relative to injuries and stuff that really precluded him from really going to a big time school. Well, anyway, the bottom line was I was lifting weights away, and I had opportunities for scholarships. Grew up in a poor family, and I'd have to really put my way through college if I was going to go to college at that time. And all of a sudden, I got hurt. And in those days, a knee injury was the death blow to scholarships because they didn't understand orthopedic surgery the way we do now. So the origin story is that I got recruited by now our late coach, Hall of Famer Roger Herring, and basically went to a small school, La Crosse State University. And the bottom line is that I played both ways in high school, and a center and defensive nose guard, linebacker. And bottom line was that I was probably recruited more for the linebacker position or nose guard position than being a center. I wasn't very tall, only about 5'10", 5'11", depending upon what measurement scale you used. Anyway, what happened was I had to put my way through, and so I had to pay tuition. My dad scraped up enough money to get enough tuition money in the first semester of my freshman year. So here I am, and I have to work my way through college, and they put me on a work study program. They say, well, do you want to do this, do that? And they gave me an option of working with custodians, doing cleaning, or they said they're starting this new thing called the Human Performance Laboratory. And would you want to work there? And I said, well, what's that? And they said, well, they study human performance and exercise, cardiac rehab. So lo and behold, our head coach said, you ought to go ahead and do that. That's kind of an extension of physical education and health education that I was in as undergraduate majors. So the bottom line was I got my introduction at a very, very young age into the world of human performance and laboratory research, even though it was nothing like we have today. In 1971, it was a very different phenomenon. But anyway, that's what started it all. And then I continued to say, well, what do we know about weight training? And I went through my college years and found out that, there was a few books, there's a few magazines, uh, York, Pennsylvania, and Bob Hoffman, and you had Joe Weider, and you had these type of things coming out. So, and Dick Berger was really the guy that was doing all the set rep studies back in the 1950s and then 60s for sure. So it was really a dearth of information that really was available on weight training. So that really drove me into the pursuit, along with my football career, which I was now playing center in college, which was a really misplacement of my skill sets, and I eventually ended up decades later talking to my head coach before he passed that, hey, I think you put me in the wrong position. That was one of the underlying actual stimulus for me to write this new book we got out, Athlete Development, to make the point that you really got to put people and young athletes into the proper position to let them be as successful as they can be. But anyway, long story short, I was very fascinated with strength training, and I was very fascinated with research and exercise. And I really primarily was working in the whole world that started in the 70s, early 70s, in cardiac rehabilitation and cardiac testing. And from there, I went started working, and I got my degree, and then all of a sudden I was married with my dear wife Joan, and we basically started our teaching career, which we were prepared to do, junior high school, elementary ed that she was doing, and I was a strength coach for the school, and I worked as a coach and a couple sports, and I've opened up the weight room, created a weight room, brought all my home equipment over to my hometown where I was, and before that, I did a great internship up at Bloomington, Minnesota, in a junior high school up there, and they had a really one of the main type of fellows that really was one of the early strength coaches, and Bud Bjorn was worked at Apple Valley and St. Louis Park, I believe. And I remember having the interactions with him a little bit when he presented how sets and rep studies, and created one of the classic books in 1975 with his little weight training book that I still have, and had testing values and everything like that. So anyway, I go on, I'm coaching, and then I get to the point where I still have that yearn for more knowledge. And what happens is that I say, we got to get a master's degree. And my wife was obviously supportive. We visited Penn State, where they kind of put me on a wait list and said, well, go back and teaching. Ohio State put me on a list, and went to Kent State, and Larry Golding had already left to go to UNLV. And all of a sudden, I was finding myself, well, where do I go to school? And the next thing I knew, Carl Marish, who was really one of the big influences in my life, I met him when he was a master's student, actually a master's research fellow out of Cal Fullerton, and he was working in cardiac rehab and in the performance lab, and he really encouraged me to keep working, studying, and I think my first college paper was strength training, of athletes, and it was just the idea that he said, hey, they're starting a new program out at the University of Wyoming. And the professor, Bruce Noble, who was one of, Tom Puritan's Ph.D. students at Illinois back in the day, kind of the father of many aspects between him and a number of early pioneers in the 1950s. I said, so I interviewed with Dr. Noble, and to get a master's degree type of, get into the program, get assistantship. And lo and behold, one of the questions he asked me, and this was back 1975, he asked me, well, what do you want to do when you get big? And I said, well, that's really a tough question. I said, well, I want to be the world's expert in resistance training. Now, if some
How
student would
crazy is
tell,
that?
if some person would tell me that today as a student,
That's crazy.
I may go, well, okay. So I was waiting for an answer from him, and typically you would have expected him to go ah. At that time that wasn't even something you even thought about. Who were
That's
world
exactly right.
training? So all of a sudden, Dr. Noble, to his still uh, living in Madison, Wisconsin today, about 89 years old now. But to his benefit, he encouraged me. He said, "Well, then you've got a lot of work to do," and off we went. So off we went developing the program, and I worked as a volunteer coach with the strength conditioning with athletics and football out at Wyoming. And then the next step I did was I took a job rather than go off with Fred Akers to Texas, which a lot of the people did, obviously. Uh, I went to a small college, Carroll College, now Carroll University, and I started my career as a small college coach, assistant coach, head wrestling, assistant football, strength coach, taught everything. I did everything but the kitchen sink for my years there, but they're very formative years because I worked with athletes. Many of them I still am in touch with. And really, realistically, that formed an interesting understanding of coaching, recruiting, and everything else, even though that's changed dramatically now. And then I had to make a decision. Do I go into big time coaching? Or, in fact, do I go back and get a PhD, which was of interest to me? Or what do I do? Because you get to a point at the small college where you had to make a decision at that young age. Well, it's old for a student age, maybe, but 27, 28 years old, what am I going to do? And you could only go so far in each of those disciplines unless you had a PhD or unless you went to the bigger schools to coach. So I got a call from uh, Carl again, and he was finishing up and going to St. Luke's Hospital. I got a call and basically said there's going to be an opening. The College of Medicine here in Wyoming and zoology, physiology, they got openings. Dr. Noble has to replace me, and he knows you. Do you want to think about coming back and doing a PhD? So it was a choice between a couple opportunities in Big Ten football coaching assistants or this one. So I went and I decided I'm going to go back and get the PhD. What drove that? Well, it's that interest in research, and I wanted to know more about the whole phenomenon of what the physiology of weight training really was. So I was very excited. I was very excited. And then I found that, I got back, started a PhD program, all gung ho excited. And I walked into my first class in molecular genetics. And I said, whoa, which at that time was before the human genome. So basically, it was based on probability equations and math, which I was pretty good at. But the bottom line is, I said, "Whoa." I went back to our little house that I lived in. With now, we had two little kids that were very young, and I told Joan, I said, I think we might have jumped off of this building a little bit too high, and she said, "Well, you better then get to work if you're going to do this." So obviously, I had to put my nose to the grindstone, and I unfortunately was really fortunate to do so. And about a year later, they changed athletic directors, and Dr. Gary Cunningham came in to be the athletic director. And he got me into the office because he knew I knew about strength in a different type of program there. And he said, "Well, why don't you take charge of the strength training?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing a PhD program." Yeah, he said, "Well, then hire somebody." So lo and behold, I put out a search, and I hired the first strength coach. Not the first. I hired the strength coach at University of Wyoming that I was excited to work with, and it turned out to be a young kid out of Kansas, Mike Clark, who now has had a stellar career in strength conditioning with I believe he went to Detroit Lions now, performance coach. But he and I started working together, and I was in charge of looking at that. And then when he left, Tom Richardson, the late Tom Richardson, took over, and I was able to do research and work with athletes and everything else in that mode of still going to school and having to do 20 million things as a doctoral fellow, teaching. I ran cardiac rehab programs. It's just amazing. I couldn't do it today. I couldn't believe let's take 15 credits a semester, ending up with about 150 credits of grad credits. But the bottom line was that this all got going. And then from there, I basically, not to continue to bore your audience, I
No.
said, I couldn't get a job. Well, here I am again. I couldn't get into school. Now I couldn't get a job. And lo and behold, I had a contact with a guy known through the lifting world, so Jim Wright, who was big into the issues with steroids and ended up working with muscle and fitness with Joe Weider's group eventually. But he was a officer in the U.S. Army. And he said, "You ought to talk to my boss." So I interviewed with James Vogel, one of the top, people in the field of exercise physiology. And I interviewed with him, and he was just a great mentor. And so I ended up joining the U.S. Army. So for 4 years, I did active duty, and I worked in the exercise phys division at Navy. He did all over the country. He was able to look at so many things in military warfighter. And to me, as I gave a recent conference at ACSM, I said, well, I really said that when a meeting's there, well, the athlete is the warfighter, the soldier is really an athlete, and I started the concept with Jim Vogel that, hey, you got to have, they started the whole soldier fitness program then, and a lot of things are going on in the Army. And I said, well, also the battlefield's an anaerobic battlefield. It's not an aerobic battlefield, which had been the routine road work that had been done in the military. So I did that, and then I didn't want to continue on in a military career and stay out of science because that's what was required back when. So I ended up taking my first job back again with Dr. Carl Marish, who seemed to be my rescue person through my whole career. I went to the University of Connecticut, and for a few years, doing all the good stuff there, working with a guy named Lee Kemp as a strength coach. I enjoyed working with all the athletes again, working with the different aspects. And basically, at that time, during my military career, I also was an adjunct at BU and also an adjunct at UConn. So I ran into Coach Jerry Martin as a student before he went on to Yale. And so that was another connection. And then what happened, I couldn't, it was so expensive, I couldn't afford to buy a house. I had three children, one special needs with Down syndrome. And all of a sudden, I couldn't even buy a house. And I said, I got to do something. And then again, the connection back with Dr. Vogel and Dr. Howard Knutkin, who was the chair and member of Boston uh, University's group and laboratory. He was going to start a new program at Penn State. And he said, why don't you interview for the director of research? So there again, the contacts, the networking that I'd done, and the respect you get from doing good work, that I interviewed there. And I said, I couldn't afford a house. So what they did before they interviewed me, they took me out with a real estate person to find out how much money it would cost for me to buy a house. Now, if you get the job, you get to how much you need to make. So that was sort of interesting. And I interviewed, I had a great thing. They hired me, and then the whole sojourn of my almost 10-year career at Penn State started. And basically, I did so many different things. It's again, my eclectic world I've lived in from day one was I did everything. I was the director of research, Center for Sports Medicine, the first sports scientist. I was also worked and developed a host of different things with later on another great scientist and mentor, Dr. Wes Heimer with Center for Cell Research, worked with the NASA Commercial Development Space, worked with Bill Evans and looking at the aging center that we got an NIH program set up, worked with ARL to look at non-lethal warfare because of my military experience, and then just worked at things with athletics where I could. And it was a very different time. So athletics at that point in time were really not as advanced as you see today. It was very much still living out in the 1970s with their training theories, etc. And then from there, I got a boost to go to Ball State, and I did that for 3 years. It was just something that there was some issues with regard to that whole 3 years. We didn't really get given to me what they promised, and then basically you learn your lesson late in life. If people don't, not everybody recruits you and gives you what you were recruited for with. And
Yep.
we then went back. Carl Marish and the dean wanted me to come back to Connecticut. I did, and spent my 14 years there. And then we also had a great opportunity for our program, which was getting too big, I think, at that time, for that period of time, to go to Ohio State. And we left in 2014 and put our program in Ohio State. And then, as I mentioned before to you in passing, I then retired in 21 December, and then grants came in 22, so I got appointed back. So I worked there at Ohio State with grant work, and then also worked with Coach Marati and Coach Doug Callender, the athletic training group, and Josh Hagan, the collaborative, to work as senior advisor for sports science, sports performance. And that's what I continue to do. So I write, I got books and papers, grants. So essentially, I'm kind of like the coach from Tampa Bay. I've just transitioned and not necessarily retired. Although I will tell you, I do miss teaching classes, which people would say you're crazy. But even in today's world where you look at all the blank faces, I still miss the teaching classes. And maybe I'll get back to part of that here with my emeritus appointment here at the University of Connecticut. So that for your audience is a very capsulated, boring view, but everybody has origin stories. Everybody has history. It's no different. I'm no different. Everybody I meet has a whole origin stories that they can tell where they end up. And I've been very blessed for many reasons, and I have no complaints about that. I think I've been very blessed by outstanding young students like you were at Penn State, outstanding graduate students, outstanding colleagues, and outstanding people that have always allowed me to progress in my desire to become what I told Dr. Noble, the world expert in weight training. And that even is a bit of a stretch. I look at myself as one that's been around a long time that can say I've been around a long time, but whether you call a world expert, that's for other people to determine. I just know what I know, and I don't know everything. We are so much yet to learn. Every time you pick something up, you learn something different. I can go on about that as well. So that's all I can tell you right now.
All right. Well, first of all, um, whenever you talk, so many things go on in my head. And the one thing I want to do before I ask you, because I want to talk about your book here in a few minutes, but I want to give a quick origin story for the audience so they understand my connection with you, and why I'm so excited to have you here on the show. And Dr. Kraemer, I'm not sure if you even know this, but first of all, I grew up in York, Pennsylvania. And growing up in York, Pennsylvania, I didn't even know, like I don't think most people in York know that it's, weightlifting capital. And we see obviously when we're driving up I-83, we see the big statue and all that stuff, but most people don't know it, and I didn't know it either. And another thing is, I was in the Army as well, so I was active for 2.5 years, and reserves for 2.5 years from 90 to 94, and it was actually towards the end when I was getting ready to get out of active towards the end of 92. I think it was about 6 months before I got out. One of the sergeants in our unit had just completed a master fitness trainer course. And he came back, and while we're doing our 2 mile runs and stuff like, or not 2 mile runs, while we're doing our runs, he would be talking about, what's going on in physiologically in the human body. And everyone would be like, shut up, Sergeant Caldwell. We don't want to hear this. And I was really intrigued. So that's actually how it started for me because it's 1992. And I went into the Army. I was closing in on 25 years old when I went into basic training. So at this point, I'm like 27. I'm an older, young Army person. And so everyone's like, "Shut up, Sergeant Caldwell." And I said to him, "This is cool, man. Show me where you learn this." So he basically gave me some of the text that he was learning from. So, anyways, flash forward to that's when I realized that, oh, exercise physiology and exercise science is a thing. So when I got out 6 months later and moved back to York, PA, that was now on my radar. And I went to Penn State, branch campus, Penn State York, through the first semester of my sophomore year. But I realized that now at this point I didn't know who you were. I'd never heard of your name. But I knew that Penn State, it's a state school, so it's cheaper, and I can use my GI Bill and Army College Fund towards this. And I also knew that it had I think at the time we were number one ranked XI program, and I know it was top rank. So in any case, I fortunately I get to go up to main campus. I think it was my second semester of my sophomore year, and then I never had you as a professor, but I can remember. I think it was second semester sophomore, sitting in a nutrition class, and a grad student from the Center for Sports Medicine came walking in and obviously had gotten the professor to agree to allow her to give this big announcement. And the announcement was, hey, we're doing a big strength and conditioning study, Center for Sports Medicine. And she, gave a little 5 minute overview and said it was when she said, it's an Army study and talked a little bit about what it would be. And again, I had just gotten out of the reserves at that point. And so this was why I was intrigued. I was real. So little did I know at the time what an impact this would literally have on my entire career, because she basically said, show up to building such and such, classroom such and such, to learn more about it. We need trainers, we need subjects, etc. So I go there, and you are standing in the front of the class. And you never heard me say this before, but you're standing in front of the class, and you're talking about the study. And I'm starting to realize at that point, all right, this is someone. I don't know who this is, but this is someone standing in front of me. So in any case, I get involved in the study, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail later. But I get involved in the study, which was an unbelievable way for me to start my career. And then my between my junior and senior year, I had I don't know if you remember Chicky Krimmel or Sharon Krimmel as an academic advisor there, but she was my academic advisor when I first got there. And I got a letter in the mail between my junior and senior year saying you won't report to her anymore. You will now report to Dr. William Kraemer at the Center for Sports Medicine. And at that point, I was now involved in the study. I understood the magnitude of who you are. And so I remember setting up a meeting with you, and and honest, look, I'm just gonna say because it's just the truth. I was like a kid in the candy store. I was like, I couldn't believe it. So in any case, so here I am sitting in front of you, and interestingly, you told some of the things that you just said about your background. That was part of our meeting, and for whatever it's worth, I'm a huge fan of history. I think, and I know you are too, and I think everybody should be a fan of history, and everyone should understand the history and not just you, but just the field itself, etc. So you can get a bigger picture and perspective of everything. So in any case, you're telling me some of your story, and my jaw's kind of dropping to the ground. And I'm realizing that I have like the Einstein of exercise, and I need to be smart enough to when I graduate from here, I need to stay in touch with Dr. Kraemer. So to wrap this up, and then to get into the first main question, I remember at the time. Now at this point, I'm like 30, going on 31. And I remember asking you, I'm scared, just like just about anybody is when they're a senior and they don't know what they want to do or what the future is going to hold for them. And I was scared. And I asked you, and this is probably something else that you don't know or realize since you stay in touch with so many people. But I asked you, what's your advice to me? What's your career advice? And your response to me, and I still say because now I teach as an adjunct at CUNY York College in Jamaica, Queens here in New York City, and I give this advice to my students, and I do a lot of mentoring as well now at this point in my career. And I repeat the story a million times. What you said to me was, and I'm going to be paraphrasing, but the gist of what you said was, if you have the time, desire, and finances to go on to grad school, you need to do it. Because not only is it going to help with your knowledge and your skill set, but it's going to open up doors for you that you just don't realize right now open up. But you said, to be successful in your career, it's also about networking, networking, network. It's exactly what you said. And I can remember it 30 years ago like it was yesterday. And 30 years later, you're exactly right. And so I just want to throw that out there as well, because even though we're going to be talking about different things, I just want people to understand, how fortunate and kind of my story and how it led to you, and then how it led to like even after I graduated, as I would come to Penn State every once in a while before you left to go to Ball State and pick your brain. When you were at UConn and I was in New York City, I would come up to UConn and pick your brain, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But yeah, I want to give the audience a background, and you a little bit too, because you didn't know I was in the Army, I don't think, and I'm not sure if you knew I grew up in the good old York, PA, and all that stuff. But I wanted to give some background about my origin as it relates to our talk today, because again, you have the benefit of hindsight, I have the benefit of hindsight, and I just am fully aware of. Holy crap, man. Little did I know when everyone was saying, shut up, Sergeant Caldwell, and I was interested in it. Little did I know that that would eventually lead to Penn State, that would lead to you as a mentor, the Army study, and then everything that happened since then. So I'm a very fortunate person.
The Medical Fitness Podcast is brought to you in part by the Medical Fitness Association. Attention, all medical fitness professionals. Get ready for the event of the year. Register today for the Medical Fitness Association Annual Conference, November 19th through the 21st in New Orleans. Network with industry experts and like-minded professionals from around the U.S. and Canada. Gain insights from leading voices in medical fitness and take your career to the next level. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity. Mark your calendars for November 19 to 21st and join us in New Orleans for the Medical Fitness Association Annual Conference. Register now at medicalfitness.org. That's medicalfitness.org.
Well, I appreciate that. I think the thing I always told myself all the time over the years is that I always knew that from that time I met with the professor at Penn State who told me to go back teaching, that basically you have to not dismiss anybody. And it's not that I've not done that. I probably have. Everybody makes mistakes. But what I found out that over the last, in fact, even the last year, how many people that I've interacted with that didn't take them on as students or just met them. And, that by kind of treating people the way you want to be treated and basically
Exactly.
have some empathy, if you can do that more than often, you're going to have a positive effect. So it's good to hear that story. Yes, I didn't know all that. I think I was aware of the Army thing, but again, there every what's been fascinating about all of us is that and I guess Duncan French, one of my former students, always talks about the Kraemer laboratory family. It stretches out, as he said, into a very big type of network, but it's really people that look at what you've done, who you are, but how the interactions were. And every really top professor in the world has a similar thing, and I'm an old coach at heart, and I think that's one of the things that people who really have that type of mentality, the coaching, and to really want to teaching. And no matter what you're in, what field, it basically stretches out, and you have that type of web of people that really are what are most important as you go through each person's life journey. So thank you for that, but I appreciate it very much. Very kind.
Yeah, and I have to something to pop in my head. I have to say one more thing. So the 495B, our final internship, which was a semester, I did at Duke University Medical Center's Diet Fitness Center, a medical weight loss clinic, and I went down there and I actually interviewed at Raleigh Hospital and another place. So I had three interviews in one day. I'm sorry, over the course of 2 days. And I just don't remember names or anything, but I mentioned while I was doing these interviews at all three places that you were my academic advisor and all that stuff. And since I ended up doing it at Duke, I'll just say that they pretty much offered it to me on the spot because of my relationship with you. And of course, I'm telling them during the interview about the Army study because I had just gotten out. That's kind of like who I was at that time. I was like Mr. Army study. But in any case, so it started as an internship, and all the fitness trainers there, the fitness staff had master's degrees in XPhys and all that stuff. And here I am, still an undergrad, finishing my undergrad, and even them, they would come up to me during my internship time, and what does Dr. Kraemer say about this? What does Dr. Kraemer say about that? What did you learn in the Army study? Programming, because that is really what I learned. That has set me apart really through my career from so many people because just the intricacies of program that I learned from you. So there's another thing that you aren't aware of that, here I am an intern at Duke Medical Center and I'm like the star for a while. It was a really cool thing. And it's because of you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think the whole phenomenon of all experiences really revolve around. I mean, during the time that you're referring to as the Army study, that was really a very important study historically because Pat Schroeder, the late Pat Schroeder, who was I believe the senator from Colorado or representative, she put a bill through on Women's Health Initiative, and we were the first one to really take a look at weight training extensively in women. And my career is really focused on a lot of things related to looking at women and looking at the whole differential and sexual dimorphisms that do exist. But with weight training, one of the things we found was in that study is that you train women really the way you do men. I mean, there's not really a sexual dimorphism in programmatic aspects, and I think people wanted to do that, and that was a type of really misunderstanding. And I think the people that I had, the doctoral fellows I had, are all out there as superstars in their own right. At that time, they've gone on to really great careers and master's students, and you got the undergraduates that we had. So a lot of people uh, benefited me from being able to undertake such a large study for the Department of Defense at that time, looking at the many dimensions of resistance training physiology that even today interacts and interfaces with what we know and what we can apply to not only athletes but also to warfighters. So that was a very important one of the many, but I think of it as a pivotal study that really is important historically in my career as well.
So I'm glad that you said that, and we're going to jump a little out of order here. But since we're talking about the Army study, I was actually going to ask you that. I was going to ask you, since you've, across your many decades of career and all the studies that you've, led and have been involved with, I was going to ask you where it lands on the totem pole. But just so the audience is aware, we've been referring to it as the Army study, but I want them to be aware that it was, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it was formerly called Strategies for Optimizing Strength, Power, and Muscle Hypertrophy in Women. And from my perspective, again, I'm in this classroom and I'm just learning about the study and what the trainers in the study would be involved with, and learned that it was, broken down into these different groups, the endurance group, the hypertrophy group, and the power group. And I was involved in all aspects of training. Well, I shouldn't say all aspects, but I was involved in the training and the testing uh, for the power group. And that was also a major thing in my career because they were the ones who outperformed the other groups in most of the outcomes. And it was and also along with conversations with you, it was obvious to me that it's because they got the strongest and the most powerful. And I took these philosophies when I was at Duke. Again, I'm doing an internship and then just out of college, and I was smart enough to know that I don't want to train everyone in the 3 to 8 repetition range to muscle failure when they're living with overweight, obesity, class 2, class 3, etc. So I was smart enough to know, no, it's a wider spectrum. It's that 6 to 15, it's RPE based, etc. But I because of you, I wasn't afraid. Even that early on in my career, I was not afraid to dip down into those lower repetition ranges and understood the magnitude of strength.
Yeah, I think the whole and you got to remember every study is placed historically in its own spot and time for what we knew and what we were trying to accomplish. Basically, what that study was about was taking the military at the time was having a lot of recruits, including women, who were making big inroads into military careers. But when you take untrained individuals, non-resistance trained, I should say, they may be recreationally fit. We even see that today in some of the studies we're doing and working with tendons. You got how do you progress them? So this study really took what would be considered a recreationally active woman, but not really strength trained per se, and then basically had different elements of training. We had as you stated, we had a group where we emphasized power but also had strength. Then we had another group that emphasized strength and less so power. And then we had upper body versus lower body only to try to see the roles that the two parts of the body. You wouldn't do that study today, by the way. It'd be almost
Right, exactly.
it would be
Which is
almost
why I was so fortunate.
would be almost malpractice to say we're going to try half the body. But in those
Yes.
cases, it was still something that was unknown. And we learned a lot from that. And then also we had a group that just did calisthenics and non-resistance trained stuff, which became a very important and probably unique in itself with regard to field studies that you can maintain strength in the field missions if you take on organized type of systematic partner exercises and loading in that way. Not as well, but it becomes kind of a maintenance program. So we looked at all different aspects, from bone to muscle to performance to hormones, etc., to try to understand these different elements. But I think the key thing was, we at the time we did, it was 6 months, which was a long study, and people don't realize, and I always talk about that with my long-term colleague, Dr. Jeff Oleg, who has been with me since a master's student in '93 all the way to currently. He's tracked my entire career, day in, day out, and continues to do so with the big giant program he's running at Ohio State now. But we talk about that. Training studies are difficult to do. Some of them in the literature will give a piece of paper of a program and say, I'll see you in 12 weeks. Not the way we did it. So the studies we've done have been where we've had personal trainers. Now people say, well, that's not the way it is in the real world. Well, no, but we're doing research quality type of work. You have to assess every darn repetition. So doing training studies, even of that length, is really demanding for a number of personnel, cost, everything else. And that's why the quality of studies, and I like at Ohio State now, and I even at Penn State, working with the teams I did in UConn for sure, with Coach Jerry Martin and Andrea Hootie and our whole program there, is that we get research quality type of stuff that coming out. And I know, just as an example, we did a whole testing profile on Ohio State football team, and it was done. I mentioned this the other day. It was done wrong, and Coach Marati and I told him we got to redo the whole thing, 100 some players. Well, that takes time, but if it's not done right, just about good enough isn't cutting. And it doesn't cut it when you make decisions about individuals who you're training, or when you make decisions about the type of studies you're going to produce and what they show. If it's not done at the best quality, you're putting your hand behind the line. You're not putting your hand over the line. You're touching the bar. You're doing this. You got to complete the repetition for 1RM. You have to have hydration before we DEXA you or do an ultrasound. All these things are highly important, that you get research quality not only in your research programs, but also in the way you do things and how you make decisions based on data. If you're going to use evidence-based type of data base, then you got to have quality data that's coming at you. So the to answer your question, I think that study is historic because, number one, it was part of the Women's Health Initiative back in the day when that was just a growing thing. And thank God to Pat Schroeder for pushing that bill through, and it allowed me to do a very extensive study that was very costly and very many people hours involved in pulling that off. So I think from that standpoint, and the benefits, even to how it dribbled into all the different pockets, from our studies to yourself to everything else, it provided a great real life atmosphere for learning and for really understanding. And by the way, we used linear periodization, which was the function, the fact we had Link Gottschalk with me at the time, who I just saw a few weeks ago, who was a strength coach at Temple for many, many years, and also a state
Totally
college.
remember him.
Yeah, so also a state college athlete in high school. It's the state champion and I believe it was a 440 the yard dash when they did that. But anyway, the point is we made sure that all of the trainers, they weren't as perfect probably as you, but majority, I'd say 95% to 98%, did things exactly the way they were trained to do it and learn.
Right.
If you didn't do it that way, I would probably get rid of you. The bottom line
That's right.
is, Nick, we had our structure was really like a coaching structure and like a military structure. And that's the kind of structure that I've used over my entire career. It's really the one where you have chain of commands. And I think the people that bought into that a lot were former athletes, former military, whereas you get some people just couldn't buy into it. And we've had a few balks along the way, but I think for the most part, that structural understanding of accomplishing mission and accomplishing or winning a game goes into the same structure where every unit has to do their job. and it's got to be done at the highest level in order to succeed. And we were very fortunate in that particular study and all the others we've done to have great teams that can do that type of work and that type of structure.
Yeah. And something else that I think is related to something that you just said, that I remember is, I graduated from Penn State in 96, flash forward to, I think, 99. I'm now in New York City. And I remember calling you up one time and I was like crying on your shoulder because I had left Duke where, again, all the training staff all had master's degrees in exercise physiology. And, look, we didn't do our programming exactly the same, but we were pretty close to being on the same page with periodizing and stuff like that and following ACSM and NSCA guidelines. And then I moved to New York City and I immediately see that, oh man, in the real fitness world, and if I ruffle some feathers here, I don't care. In the real fitness world, hardly anyone has a degree in exercise science. Hardly anyone is certified through the ACSM or NSCA. And I remember calling you up and crying on your shoulder and basically saying, like the reality of the one says this, one says that fitness world had hit me. And during the course of our conversation, I think I said to you, I wish that everyone would train people similar to what I experienced in the Army study. And your response was something like, that's kind of how people should do it. People should be as close to scientific as possible in the way they, and then also with the concept of periodization which we'll talk about in a little bit. But that was like the gist of your response, and that was a real big light bulb moment for me. I was like, that's right. We really should be as evidence-based as possible. Like, to you and me, that's just common sense, but it's not common sense in the fitness world out there. But you really do need to be as evidence-based as possible and try to be as scientific as possible in the way you program.
Yeah, I think that's there's always, like I say, there's no amount of studies that will take you to each step forward as you go in the practical world. But you do have a compass that could tell you I should be going north, somewhere north,
Exactly.
not south. And then if you do the data correctly, we find out that then the individualization occurs. But you don't do things that are completely south. For example, saying I'm just going to use light weights and that'll get you stronger. Well, it will to a certain extent, but it's not something you can just keep lifting light weights unless over and over and expect to get stronger per se. But again, I always tell people the big word I said, maybe I said it back then too, but the word I've said over and over is just before we answer a question, give me your context. Your context is so important for the answer to the question because, as I've talked many times to you before and others, it's a toolbox. You got this toolbox of all this technology and facilities, of equipment, everything else is in that toolbox. You're not, and everything. So you pick out a tool to try to build the body, build the athlete, build the individual trainee, build the cardiac patient. And the bottom line is that everything has a context, and you got to pick the right tool. And yeah, but what I say is when you test somebody, when you do something, and you want to have them fill out the workout card properly, it's got to be done perfectly in order for you to have valid data to be able to make decisions on. Otherwise, you're making decisions on guesses that aren't there, and you could be guessing wrong and doing damage to the individual or damage to the field just because you've done a sloppy job, just about good enough, and it's maybe pushed. It's just not the way we should do things. So one of the things in the lab and in the work of with the people I do, I push that concept, and that's a hard one because it takes discipline, hard work, and it's not easy. And nobody wants to hear that. No, we got to redo the whole test because of the fact we did do it correctly. This type of thing. So anyway, it's part and parcel of quality data, quality interpretations, understanding where science directs us in general. Are there alternatives? Are there different scenarios? Yes, they're always there. Give me the context, and that's one of the things we always talk about.
Yeah, and you know what? This is a perfect segue into your new book. So let me let the audience know that you recently co-authored a new book, and it's titled "Developing the Athlete: An Applied Sports Science Roadmap," which is a lot of what you're just hitting on, for optimizing performance. It's available on Amazon.com, published through Human Kinetics. And so th to me, this is kind of like what you were alluding to, because this book is well, before we hit record here, and we were just talking candidly, you were saying about how the book is just kind of like it hits eight big icebergs. And as I go through it, I think to my, because I again, I this is almost embarrassing for me to say because I pale in comparison, but I teach a strength and conditioning course that I created from scratch at City University of New York in Queens at York College. And so I bring that up because I know what it's like to teach a strength and conditioning course over the course of 15 semesters. And your book is like years worth of information if you really just start to funnel down. But in any case, I want you to just I'm actually curious what led to the writing of the book, and what would you want our listeners to know about it?
Well, I think the book was really just something that was written in parcel what I mentioned before in my career. I one of the things that's in there probably buried was the fact that for our goal as professionals, whether it be sport performance, strength conditioning, professors, whatever it is to optimize the people we work with. And basically, to do that, we've got to put them in a position where they can succeed and have good self-esteem in the process. Do we all win? Do we all become the Olympic champion? No. I've got a quote in the book that says, I remember some guy said, anybody can be a world champion. No, anybody can't be a world champion. There are all types of, we talk about the athlete composite. In order
Yep.
to have the right athlete composite and all the different features, you have to have genetics, training, all these things. We talk about that. So I wanted to give people perspectives. For me, it was back to the fact that I should have never played center in college football. I should have been a nose guard linebacker, really to play the position that I would be much more, applicable to for performance. But I did it because it was a different time in history. I was a strong dude, and basically I got away with the techniques that were legal back then that are illegal today in blocking. So, but I think the book was written really to kind of pull together a lot of the concepts that we have. And I told you before when we talked, they're like each chapter is like a tip of a big iceberg. So it talks about get you going on something, but then you got to really do a lot of deep dives to really understand it. But in order to do that, I wanted to put it forth and to say this is how it goes in each segment development of that athlete. And we discuss some and refer you to basic other information, whether it be youth and resistance training, of which I wrote a book on. And one of the former students, Abe Fagenbaum, now at College of New Jersey, created his whole career as one of the world's expert on that. You basically have all the different tips that lead to a process of what I say dealing with the athlete composite. And that athlete composite is really something that is basically made up of a whole bunch of multivariate features, of which you have mutable and non-mutable characteristics. The largely non-mutable characteristics are genetic. Hand size. I can't train you to get bigger hand size. I can't train you to be 7'1". I can't train you to have a wingspan of 7 feet. I can't train you to have a bigger ankle or a smaller, better Achilles tendon distance. A lot of these things are largely non-mutable. We can enhance things. We can improve bone density, tendon stress, tendon strength, and we can muscle stiffness, tendon stiffness. But I have things that I got. That's basically who you are. And then I have the physiological systems I can train as mutable. So, but the big question became in the book is really then how do I basically match that to the right sport? And again, there are some things that if you don't start playing golf early in your life, I doubt you're going to be sitting at 30 years old or 25 years old, say, I think I'm going to take up golf. Now, you might be a unicorn, but I doubt you're going to make the PGA, PGA tournaments based on starting golfing when you're 25, 30. And same thing with a lot of other sports, and it depends. There's always exceptions to the rule. I hate saying absolute. There's always exceptions. Every time you think nothing is possible, it is possible. And but they're the exceptions with high probabilities that they even made it from that standpoint, as we see. But the book really goes into this whole construct of, okay, here's what we're going to deal with. Here's the athlete composite. Here's what we need to do to enhance the athlete composite. Here's the testing we need to evaluate it. Here's what we need to do to systematically change it. Here's recovery. The biggest thing today is I was at this ACSM meeting, giving a symposium with three colleagues of mine, and the recovery technologies, especially for use in the military now, are exceptional. There's so many wearables. There's so many different ways to get recovery, but again, they have to be valid and reliable. They got to be utilized in the field environments, and so there's lots of things that go into that, and people are working on that. So the book really gets into that kind of array of what you need to know to really develop the athlete. And finally, most important thing is nobody do it by themselves. So we promote the whole idea of the athlete development team, the player development team of people, of professionals that all contribute. And we talk about the fact that there has to be alignment. You got to have common value systems. You got common understanding. And then we talk about the 3 C's. You got to have your credentials. So your credential. You got to, you got to have your, then you have to also have your competence. You may be credentialed, but you're not competent. You
Yep.
haven't done your work, and then you got to have the commitment to really put out the best by onward study, by keeping moving in your field, by doing the things that committed to really doing the work. Or am I going to go out golf all the time and really dedicated to golfing, but I'm really not committed to doing the job for that athlete I'm responsible for in a player development type of team. So many people say, well, what do I do? I mean, I'm a high school coach. Oh, I don't have these people. Well, you do like Coach Mike Nitka did back in the day at Muskego High School in Wisconsin. He created the Human Performance Center. Then he went, got experts and linked the different things he needed to know to help develop those junior high and high school kids in this center training. And then he was good at messaging too. I always was amazed at how I would interview some of his uh, young boys and girls, young men and women, and they could tell you why they're doing something. I remember interviewing a young 7th grade young lady, and I asked her, "Oh, are you lifting weights? Are you an athlete?" She says, "No, I'm just." Coach Nitka said young women need to lift weights and lift heavy weights eventually because we got to increase our bone density because it peaks at about 21 years of age. So I wish my junior and college kids know that. I mean, the bottom line is messaging and getting the facts right, and then being able to develop athletes. That was really the essence of what we did. I was fortunate to have Coach, Dr. Nick Radamus, who was a Ph.D. fellow of mine at Connecticut, Ball State in Connecticut. Just an outstanding uh, uh, student, just a genius on all levels. I wrote the book from ACSM, Strength Conditioning for ACSM. Just an amazing person who also was a 500-pound bench presser himself. And nobody wanted him because they thought he was big and, well, how can you do it? I took him, and he turned out to be a diamond in the rough. And then Coach Tom Newman, who was at Yale and then works up in Boston now, and really was interested in understanding things. And we applied, tried a lot of things at Yale to really get a feel for, am I right? So I've been doing that my whole career. I don't know if I'm right. Here's the context. Does it work? Does it work? Timing, how we look at things and the various aspects. And you get feedback, just like we're doing at Ohio State now, trying to understand the different elements. And there's so many different versions. So this book came out really as something I wanted to say. So the other reason to write a book is to educate people, like we're doing with our 4th edition of XViz book. That's really to educate young students. This book was written really to say what I want to say about athlete development, because I've worked with it my whole career, and I tried to do it to myself, and I didn't know. I wish I would now be 12 years old and know that I could have somebody working with me with all these principles.
Yeah.
Through my career, and that happens, But we're still at one point. My final point I'll make is athlete development, player development, we're really just crawling out of the cave. So we got all the technology and the bells and whistles and everything else, but we're really just kind of crawling out of the cave yet to actually get it implemented and translated to that athlete in total. And some places, I believe we're trying hard to do it right with the Human Performance Collaborative at Ohio State, and then you have the Performance Innovation team, and then you have the whole team over here of athletes and performance coaches trying to meld together in commonality, doing that type of thing. But again, it's still, everybody has various versions that they're doing at various universities, but we're still, crawling out. And then a lot of the health fitness world will try to use a similar model. We got asked that question. And the model works because everybody is an athlete somewhere, even if you're a cardiac rehab patient. When I was at Wyoming, I had ranchers that had to recover from, heart attacks or bypass surgery. And in the old days, they would just say, well, you go back. Well, you're a rancher. You got to be hoisting bales, feeding cattle, and riding horses. How can you do that if you've just been doing your walking? You got to do some lifting. You got to reduce the amount of heart stress by increasing peripheral, strength so that the heart stress is less. We've learned that over the years. Avery Fagenbaum and I, when he was a student at BU and I was on his committee and worked with him, we did both a master's and a Ph.D. work with the group up there, showing that you can do acute weight training pretty heavy. Just don't do the overheads with, the early phase rehab. And basically, you also can train people, and that was kind of early going in the early 1990s. But so it really is a book that basically was encompassing a lot of things I wanted to say. Couldn't say it all, as you know, but it gives the tips of the iceberg for people to at least have to think about something.
This episode of the Medical Fitness Podcast is brought to you by the Medicine, Rehab, and Fitness Institute. The MRFI has been co-founded by medical, rehab, and fitness practitioners who see the medical necessity in getting people to be more active and fit. There is a sleeping giant of opportunity to building a more active population, an opportunity which lies in a more effective medical referral pathway to exercise programs and professionals equipped to serve that pathway. To learn more about our services and how we're working to make this a reality, visit mrfinstitute.org. That's mrfinstitute.org.